Hey guys, so we're back after quite some time. Um, this is our first episode since last semester, I believe, and it's
Mhm.
quite an important one because we have our cameras on for the first time. Yay! Um, yeah, so today we'll be discussing a TED Talk that I made last semester. The theme of the TED Talk was legacy, what we hope to leave behind, and my TED Talk was on the world order, the rules-based world order. It's past, present, and future, and yeah. So today we're going to be talking about it. I must say it wasn't really my best speech ever. We had quite a busy term last semester, so it wasn't that well prepared, and I was probably a little nervous on stage. So I think between the second, third, or fourth paragraphs, you might see a rather obvious pause, and that was when I basically forgot all of my script and I had to start kind of speaking in an impromptu manner. So yeah, but yeah, we'll see how I did, and yeah, we can start now.
Let's play the speech.
This is the Doomsday Clock. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally don't like things that have the sole goal of telling us how close we are to destroying all of humanity. That's exactly what it does. And to boot, it tells us how we are consistently working toward that goal, with a few rare exceptions. Now, even though I don't like it, and there are many issues with it, perhaps we should still pay some attention. After all, it was founded by individuals including Albert Einstein, John J. Oppenheimer, and many people who participated in the Manhattan Project. Today, Nobel laureates and globally recognized leaders participate. The media schadenfreudely reports on it whenever it comes out worldwide. It makes headlines each year. Now that's quite a bit of ethos.
Okay, so would you like to elaborate on this doomsday clock a bit more?
Yeah, so the Doomsday Clock is a uh, concept. It's basically a clock that tells us how close we are to midnight. Tells humanity how close we are to midnight. And midnight here means catastrophe or extinction for mankind. And I first came across this concept in around seventh or eighth grade when I was reading the news. And, it was really a very new and striking idea to me because before that I had never really found anything like this. And it seemed quite interesting. And I didn't really think there was really uh, that a credible thing that talked about how close humanity was to its demise. And it was credible. It had quite a bit of ethos, as I mentioned in this speech, because, you know, I first found it on very, on globally acclaimed news outlets, for example, CNN, Reuters, and The Guardian, all of these news outlets. And, I found that each year since then, this the Doomsday Clock, it makes headlines globally at least once a year. And the title of that news article is always strikingly similar. It's Doomsday Clock moves closer to midnight. Humanity is closer to its demise and stuff like that. So it was quite an interesting concept, and it was founded after the Second World War by the Bulletin of Nuclear Scientists, I believe, including, as I mentioned in the speech, Albert Einstein, John J. Oppenheimer, and so on. And its function in this speech is basically it was basically I used it to bring out the world order, as you'll see very soon. Um, yeah, but this concept, it's a very interesting concept, of course, and it's fun to talk about this clock that predicts or measures humanity and humanity's well-being. But yeah, over the years, I think there's been quite a bit of criticism on it, and I personally don't like it much either, as I mentioned. Um, and I think mostly it's because I think its accuracy is up for debate. For example, right now we're at 85 seconds to midnight, I believe, and that's fairly close to midnight. Um, but I think for reference, but I just don't think it's very accurate because, for example, um, we are at closer to midnight now than during some periods of the Cold War. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also another incident which was perhaps um, more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, but less well known, is the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident, which is basically when once one Soviet soldier um was the difference between perhaps what could have been nuclear war and safety. So basically, I'll slightly talk about this incident because I don't think it's that well known. Basically, according to Wikipedia, 3 weeks after the Soviet military had shot down a Korean Airlines flight, um, this Soviet soldier called Petrov, he was the duty officer at the command center for a nuclear early warning system, and 3 weeks after this incident, the warning system basically warned that there was a nuclear missile launched from the U.S., followed by four more, and this was a very serious situation because if he reported it up to his superiors, then perhaps there could have been a preemptive attack by the Soviets on the United States, and that would have resulted in large-scale nuclear war. But he made the correct decision, very brave, but ultimately correct decision to believe that these were false alarms, and so he is credited by some for saving the world. And this actually, I only came across this incident because he passed away quite a few years ago, and there's this news article that said, the man who saved the world has passed away, and so I clicked into that and found that well, it has something to do with this. But even these, obviously, they were very existential crisis moments of existential crisis, and the fact that we are closer to demise or destruction today than during even those two moments, I find that to be rather uncredible. Uh, and also many scholars also do agree with that. So I mean, it's an interesting concept, but I don't think it's something that should be taken that seriously. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually agree with your judgment. I think the doomsday clock should be like primarily used as something for like public communication, like letting the audience and the citizens know about the potential like dangerous situation that the world community is facing right now. Rather than treating it as perhaps an academic tool or something to study like international relationship. I think that's not what it's meant for. And yeah, I totally agree. I do think that during the Cold War that you are definitely facing a lot more pressure and the world is much more, I would say, much more closer to its demise and compared to now. But I would also argue that currently the world is facing a whole diverse array of problems that people back then may not face or may not even realize they might face. And I think you've also discussed those in the later sections of the talks. So let's continue.
Yeah. According to the clock, the Doomsday Clock, which is quite a cheerful name, there are four main threats that our world faces today. The threat of nuclear war, the threat of climate change, biological technology, and also rising new disruptive technology, including artificial intelligence. Now, these four challenges are quite different from each other, but they share at least one thing in common, and that's they're global. They're global in the sense that they appear globally, their impacts are felt globally, and they need to be and can only be addressed globally. Now, for there to be a global solution, there needs to be cooperation between countries. And in terms of cooperation, well, for the past 80 years, humanity has been experimenting with a system called the rules-based world order.
Okay, so you talked about like four disruptive forces, uh, which are nuclear ones, climate ones, and technology, and what's the remaining one? Biological?
Yeah, I think it was biological threats.
Okay, I see. I think that's also quite important. I know it's probably not our expertise or the subject of our podcast to talk about like AI and the like the doomsday clock, but I think it is really a hotly debated topic. I would say currently, no matter on the internet or in terms of the public policy forums across the United
Yeah.
States and all of the world. So yeah, there are certainly a lot of like pessimistic views, which I believe they are saying like the best that the humanity can become is become the slaves of the AI, and the worst is that the AI will simply like kind of like eliminate humankind. So what do you think on this topic?
I don't know. I haven't really followed the development of AI that much, and yeah, it
Hmm.
is a ubiquitous topic, I think, in everywhere really today. You look at obviously in the fields of like science and computer science, they're all over AI, but also in politics and even the humanities, everyone's also talking about AI, how to, bring AI into the classroom. Um, and yeah, I find that what I find most fascinating about AI is actually not um, what in which direction it will bring us, because honestly, I have very little insight on that, and AI is developing at such a rapid speed. I think it's very difficult for us to predict where it may or may not go. Um, Personally, what I find most interesting about AI is the competition between the various models and various AI companies. But yeah, that's not really relevant. Um, what I will say is that I think at present, or at least AI in its present form, it may develop in the future. But I think in its present form, it is very important to use AI. It can uh, really improve productivity and efficiency by by but exponentially. And so yeah, it is very important to use AI and also perhaps have enough money to buy the more expensive models
Hmm.
um
Yeah,
to
yeah.
help. Yeah, but I think in this part of the speech I was quite happy with myself because I somehow found a way to uh connect the doomsday clock to what I wanted to talk about, which is global cooperation. Yeah, so I was quite happy with this part. Um and but here I already started forgetting things. For example, um I wanted to add a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. In regards to why there needs to be why these challenges need to be addressed globally. And I wanted to quote his saying that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and kind of make the argument that they're kind of parallel. But I already started forgetting things here, and up to this point, I think when I was making the speech, I was quite happy with myself because I was like, okay, I got the first three paragraphs down, and that's a good start because I think the biggest fear of everyone who does any public speaking is you start forgetting at the very beginning because you know there's no way to freestyle, and when you forget at the very start you just seem like an idiot to the audience. So yeah, I was quite happy with myself then. But yeah, I think things started kind of going downhill from there on, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I agree. I think public speaking is certainly like a more intimidating stuff like podcasts because obviously,
Mm,
yeah, we should probably move on with the speech though.
yes. The importance of rules are taught to us from a very young age. We follow them at school, at home, in society, and thus it follows that we should also have them on the international stage, instead of allowing the international stage or the world system to act as the inherent anarchy that it is, at least according to the realist school of international relations. So, with this system, one thing is very Yeah, I think
important
this is where I
that is
started
obviously that
forgetting
nobody tells
everything.
us.
Yeah, I think this is where I started forgetting everything, and yeah, I couldn't remember the next sentence, so I started. So you'll find that the next like 1 to 2 sentences are just complete nonsense. I don't know what I'm saying, and I was just
Okay.
trying to think about my next point, and I eventually found it, but it really kind of you know um Yeah, I found it, but the rhythm, it was slightly, I don't want to say broken, but obviously it had adverse impacts on that, and yeah, it just wasn't so smooth from here.
Yeah, but I would say you have a good improvised skill though.
Yeah, I had like the main points in mind, and I also had some. Um, it'd be a great, of course, if we could, have we could have a screen to show us the script, but the only thing on the screen was our PPT, which I had some reminders on the PPT, but not so much. So yeah, it was rather uncomfortable here, but yeah, I am kind of proud how so I kind of collected myself and
Mhm.
finished the speech. Yeah, even if it
Okay,
wasn't
so
that good.
yeah, let's
Yeah.
move on to see how you fare.
We need rules in this rules-based world order. Now, for us to have rules in this rules-based world order, there needs to be leading powers to enact them. So after the end of the Second World War, perhaps the single largest man-made disaster in human history, and more so after the Cold War, leading countries set out to change the way the world functioned, to take action proactively to leave a better world order behind. Not through force, as is the case in anarchy, but by applying rules, through international law, institutions, and cooperation. As a result, we got a not-so-anarchic world. And it's worked, more or less. Looking at its report card since World War II, World War III hasn't happened yet. It has created a great amount of wealth and prosperity, and while uneven, it has spread globally. The importance of human rights has been instilled around the world. Great strides have been made in life expectancy, health, and also education. And also, it has provided us with a system to communicate and hence the potential and ability to cooperate on matters of great international importance, such as climate change.
Yes. So you talk about like how the rules-based order has been formed. You said it was after World War II, right? That the great nations are beginning to take steps proactively, and you cite all of those like increasing metrics that are commonly used to measure development. So I kind of have a question here. So is this really like the product of a rule-based order, or is it simply the product of, let's say, modernity or like industrialization and all those sort of stuff?
I think the rules-based world order certainly contributed to this. I mean, the extent, of course, is debated, but I think it certainly contributed to it. For example, um, there hasn't been major there hasn't been conflicts between major powers since the end of the Second World War, at least not direct conflict. Uh, um, the institutions and the institutions brought by the world order, they certainly have helped. I think in terms of trade and globalization. The United Nations has also helped. I think in many cases, right? While I don't I personally have a decently pessimistic view on the United Nations and its future. But I think, it did play a very important role, I think, after the end of the Second World War in terms of things like, you know, setting out the world, how it was going to work, some of the systems involved. It played a very important role, I think, in decolonization. And, really, even though, sometimes it wasn't administered or enforced in this way, at least I think it created a consensus around the world on the importance of human rights, right? And that's something that wasn't present before the United Nations and the rules-based world order. And also, as I mentioned, I think it also created a platform for countries to discuss great matters of international importance, albeit sometimes unsuccessfully. But at least there is that platform where people can turn to, countries can turn to. So I think, yeah, I think the rules-based world order certainly contributed to it. But I will say one thing. When I was writing this this paragraph, it was really kind of hard to pin down when the rules-based world order really started because before World
Yeah.
War II, obviously, obviously they you know people did try things. I think so. Yeah, the concert of Europe was, I think, the first notion of a rules-based world order, and obviously with the League of Nations after the First World War, there was also an attempt to walk into to take a step in this direction, but the League of Nations failed, obviously for I think various reasons that IB history students are well acquainted with, so I'll not make any comments on that regard. Um, but after the Second World War, the UN was established, and I think the UN has, probably been slightly more successful than the League of Nations. And but it was also hard to pin down when, you could really consider it the rules-based world order because, you know, the the 30 years or so of the Cold War, that wasn't really, ideal for the rules-based world
Hmm.
order.
Yeah,
So
so I was like gonna ask you, like, do you think there is like a rules-based order during the Cold War, or
yeah, I'm not like so sure about this. I wanted to read a very important book in this regard called World Order by Kissinger, but I wanted to read it before I made this speech. So basically I had like probably a month and a half to like it was probably a month and a half between signing up and making the speech, and I think there was about a half a month where they chose the people who were going to speak. And so there was around I would say 20 days or so for me to write the speech between being selected to make it and really making it on stage. And I wanted to read the World Order, the whole book, in these 700 pages in 20 days or so. But obviously I did not succeed in that endeavor. Um, I think there's a leading realist called John J. Mearsheimer. He's an offensive realist. He's a very important offensive realist. Um, he believes that the only time where there was really a world order was between um, the end of the Cold War and I think the early 2010s, um, because that was when the Cold War ended, and it was the unipolar moment where the United States was the only great power in the world. He believes that was the only time where there was truly a rules-based world order, and I mean, I guess I agree with him because I don't really think the Cold War should be counted as a rules-based world order.
yeah,
I
I
think
also kind of
perhaps
see his
like
point. Yeah.
yeah, I guess perhaps it could be counted as one, but not a global rules-based world order because I think it kind of functioned in the United in like in the West, in Western Europe and the United States with the Marshall Plan and everything. But yeah, I guess a truly global rules-based world order probably only started flourishing after the Cold War, and I think where it ends is perhaps debatable whether it has ended today or it hasn't. But yeah, I don't really think the Cold War is the best example of the rules-based world order functioning.
Hmm. Yeah, so what I want to say is that I don't really think that those progresses in the world, whether it's economic or socially, it's actually bought by the so-called world order. Yes, because I think like during the 70s and 60s, there's like actually not that trade, like between the major countries. Yes, there are trade uh within the Western circles, I think, between like the Western Europe countries and the North American countries and probably Japan. And yeah, I agree. Probably Japan did achieve like economic prosperity and advances in social conditions because of like globalization or because of other stuff. But I don't think like other countries are actually profiting from this world order. I think maybe decolonization is gonna happen anyways because of like the two superpowers regardless of world order, and they are, despite the fact that there are like less war in general, you say, like between countries or even regional powers, but there are also like I would say countless coups in Latin America, in Africa, and in probably Southeast Asia and Middle East in those countries, and these also cause massive devastation to the population and to the economic development of the countries. And when we talk about trade, I think there really isn't much trade uh like from the part of the communist countries or from the Latin American countries, because of Latin American countries in the 60s and in the 70s they were kind of like having protected tariff and having not like those export oriented modes of development. So I don't think like global trade actually help them that much in terms of their economic prosperity and their increase in like life expectancy and all those sort of stuff. And yeah, so that's my take. But I would
Yeah,
say
but
that like the world order or any sort of stuff did like contribute to like uh international cooperation and all those sort of stuff. But yeah, without like world order, I think we will still have a bunch of like regional cooperation, whether that's like the Southeast Asian organization or the European Union or the South American ones. I think those economic cooperation might still materialize despite a worsening of the world order.
yeah, well, I think um yeah, I think the Cold War years aren't exactly the best years to talk about the world order. Yeah, perhaps probably there wasn't much trade between the two blocks in the 60s and 70s. But I think the world order still it did contribute to trade and globalization in like the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, because I
Yeah, I
think after
agree.
the end of the Cold War, trade did flourish across the world. And yeah, I think the world order still, I think, more or less did contribute to that. Also, I think
But I also think that was kind of because of like the neoliberal policies that the countries are putting forward that like kind of like destroy the tariffs they were setting as the WTO. I think those played a more major role. Though I think a
but
stable world order also helped, but
WTO is also part of the world order, isn't it? The WTO, all these
yeah,
international organizations
but I would
are
argue that
encompassed.
those neoliberal reforms are in fact of greater importance.
Yeah, but these were values that were brought to the world, I think, mainly under the auspices of the world order by the Western countries. I think, it
Yeah.
was a platform to, spread these ideas across the world.
I would argue it is brought by Western countries, but I would not necessarily argue that um probably if there was Soviet Union, yes, the countries would not have those neoliberal reforms. But if there was no Soviet Union, but there was also no order, but I still think those reforms might still take place, I would argue. Yeah. So yeah, we
Okay.
should also move on.
Yeah, but okay. Yeah, I mean, I still think, it certainly has contributed. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't think,
I
of course,
agree.
it's not like the deciding factor of these advances, but yeah, I think it still has played a role, and I think that's quite quite accurate.
Yeah, certainly, yes, there is a role. I would also argue that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So it seems like it's done quite well. However, of course, it isn't as perfect as I just made it out to be. One of the main faults that we hear of quite often, in fact, is the double standards and hypocrisy that are present in this system. Many question whether the rules apply uniformly on all countries. Many question whether the leading powers abide by the rules they themselves set out. And quite bluntly, the answer is quite often no. Yet there's something very interesting about this hypocrisy, and it's that the hypocrisy, or perhaps rather the veneer of principle and the rule of law that it has created, is very important in sustaining this rules-based world order because of the way it has incorporated weaker countries. When these principles and values are instilled upon the whole world, not only do they affect the weaker countries, but they also make the leading powers feel, or make them forced to feel, obliged to justify their behavior in moral terms. Now, this gives weaker countries a language with which to resist the power of the strong. This, in combination with international law and the institutions set up to protect and support these principles and values, give weaker countries an avenue to contest the power of the strong on relatively equal grounds by appealing to shared.
Yes, so what you are arguing here is that the world order was like sustained by the veneer of like the hypocrisy or some sort of stuff. I didn't really catch that, but so you're really stating that it was a hypocrisy, but it benefited the whole world. Is that the correct interpretation?
No, I think it was that it's that the common accusation of the common cited flaw of the international order being that it has double standards and it is in many ways hypocritical. It is more complicated than that. While of course being hypocritical, having double standards is a flaw. Um, it is a flaw that has sustained the world order because without the hypocrisy or without the veneer of principle that this hypocrisy created, the order would it would be in a very bad place, perhaps as we are seeing in the world today.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually agreed with that, and I think we've also discussed about the double standards and like hypocrisy in the episodes before. Yes, so we should
Yeah, yeah. I should probably mention that I got this point from a very well written article published in the Foreign Affairs by Professor Matthias Spector from a very distinguished university in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Um, the article is titled "The World Will Come to Miss Western Hypocrisy," and I think it's a very well written article. And it really, when I read it for the first time, it was pretty. It really did make. It was very impressive. Yeah. So shout out to Professor Spector. It was a really great
yeah.
article. Yeah.
Okay, so we should move on.
Mhm. Standards, invoking international law, and demanding consistency between words and action. As a result, this system, for perhaps the first time in history, made great power behavior answerable, even if incompletely, to something beyond raw interest, allowing creating an order that weaker countries could consent to, support, and participate in willingly. This order, with legitimacy brought by moral high ground under the guise of rule of law, proved to be much more stable and sustainable than previous world orders that humanity has seen. Of course, there were people who questioned many of its principles and values, and of course, there were geopolitical considerations behind certain acts. But as long as this veneer of principle and law and values persisted, so could the system. Recently, the system has been disappearing because the veneer has been disappearing, and many people believe that it is the beginning of the end of the current world order.
Yes, so just kind of to like summarize your point here, I think maybe we all know like what you're talking about, but maybe you would love to like elaborate to the audience that haven't been following the global news that much about why like the international or rules-based international order are actually collapsing. And I think that is a question that some of your audience might have when listening to this TED Talk.
Yeah, I don't think many people in the audience really got what I was talking about. Many people just saw that, the speech was pretty dry, didn't seem very coherent and, probably quite boring. But
That's
yeah, I
probably
think there
what my
was.
consultant thought.
Oh yeah, that's sad. But yeah, I mean, I think there is still some academic merit in it. And I tried to be funny in some places, but I don't think it really worked out. Anyway, yeah, so I think basically in recent times there has been a change in how armed intervention, especially by leading powers, specifically perhaps the United States, has been justified on the world stage. So I think in the past, it was justified using international law and moral on a high moral ground. You know, even when there was no high moral ground or international law to justify it on. For example, a good example would be the second Iraq War when the younger Bush invaded Iraq and said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Um, it has been, this the Iraq War and the second Iraq War has often been cited as, when the war rules-based world order, its credibility took a big hit because, obviously there were no weapons of mass destruction, and um, Powell went to the United Nations Security Council with whatever that small whatever he had in his hand. Um, but at least at the time, there was an attempt to justify it by framing Iraq as threatening the world's security, and there was an attempt to force votes through the UN and to get authorization for the invasion, which they in the end the alliance did get. And later on, other armed interventions, again, mostly led by the US, for example, in Afghanistan, they were also, it was the war on terror. Um, so there was always justification for these armed interventions um, that, that appealed to moral high ground in international law. And, of course, many people, talked about their ulterior motives. For example, you didn't want to invade Iraq to protect the world. There was no democracy involved, but, you wanted to invade Iraq because there was a lot of oil and stuff like that. But um, accusations, and um, perhaps they were true, but nobody in the government ever admitted to that. But that has happened, I think, in recent in at least the past year or so, where there is no longer this guise of
Mm-hmm.
trying to justify these armed interventions through international law. For example, when the president of the United States says that you know they attacked Venezuela because they wanted oil, that's just not going to. That's of course, anytime any country, the United States or any country, attacks oil-rich countries, there's going to be accusations, and it's probably true that oil played a role in that. But it's very different when it's said aloud, and I think that it does cause it has caused quite a bit of damage on the international rules-based order. Other things that cause this damage include, for example, um, saying that the United States, the most powerful country in the world, wants to annex its close allies and neighbors, right? For
Mm-hmm.
example,
Yes,
Canada
we have
and
also
Greenland.
covered that in previous
Yeah, we've
episodes. Yes.
yeah, we've also covered that. The credibility of the system, the even the veneer that there is, rule and law and order and principle on the world stage, that the world stage is not a place where uh the powerful do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Even the guise of that being true it's just it's ripped open, and that really does hurt the credibility of the rules-based order. And, also, for example, starting trade wars and slapping tariffs on friend and foe alike, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the United States starts trade wars with, so-called adversarial countries. For example, it's trade wars with China. Yeah, perhaps, in the Western rules-based world order that can be justified. But when, when these sanctions are and tariffs are slapped on the whole world at the same time, it's very hard for that to be justified, even within the alliances. So yeah, that's basically what I was talking about here. Um, Recent actions have uh, really, I think, um, dealt quite a lot of dealt quite a heavy blow on the veneer of principle and law that
Mm-hmm.
was, I believe, quite important to the system and its sustenance. Is that a word? I'm not sure if that's a word, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll move on. Yeah, I kind of agree with your point, and uh yeah, so maybe it's yeah, I think we should just move on because of time.
Now, while perhaps that's true, I don't know if that's entirely a bad thing. Of course, if we don't do anything about it, it most likely would be, as we would return to the anarchy that the world is and all of the war and suffering that it may or may not bring. Now that's a philosophical question. Um, but perhaps it's also a chance for us to look at the world order, to look at it in its entirety, and see if we can fix some of its fundamental issues. So while we are in a crisis, I would like to quote a quote often misattributed to former US President John F. Kennedy, a quote that I find especially fitting for our audience today because all of us can speak Chinese. He once said, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is made up of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. So while yes, we are perhaps in a crisis with the current world order, it is perhaps ailing, it is also perhaps an opportunity for us to, again, look at it in its entirety, address some fundamental inequities, make it more suitable to address certain pressing issues, and also, in general, just renovate and rebuild the old and creaky house so that it can sustain and brave storms that are certainly coming our way in the future.
Yes, well, so I kind of have a question here. If the current um rules-based world order is failing, which according to you have bring like progress economically and socially, how are we like gonna able to find a better replacement of it that's gonna bring even better like progress and equity in the near future?
Yeah, that's obviously a very good question. And yeah, obviously I wanted to answer that question in the speech because I had to put a positive spin on it. I couldn't say, "Oh, the world order is it's failing, and the future is stark, and there's no hope in the
Yeah.
future." Which one, it isn't true, and obviously, secondly, that's not how you can't say that in a TED talk, even if it were true, because TED talks have to be upbeat and optimistic and everything like
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
So obviously, I wanted to answer that question better, and I was trying to find a good answer, but yeah, I really didn't have the time to answer it extraordinarily well, and also I don't have that expertise to be frank, to be honest. Basically, what I settled on in this speech was basically that yeah, it is failing, but the past order, it did have many issues with it. For example, equity, right? When
Yeah.
you talk about the UN, many people talk about the vetoes that the vetoes that the five countries have. They talk about the bureaucracy in the UN and how it is unable to really enforce many of the principles and values that it has, also the resolutions that it has. They talk about the lack of representation in the United Nations regarding for new countries, and I think predominantly third world countries. So there are many issues, and you know as I said in the speech, perhaps it is a chance, the fact that it is failing, um, it, as long as we recognize the need for there to be a world order, um, since it's failing, you have to do something about it. And in the process of, propping this world order up, perhaps you can also see some of the, flaws and, try to address some of them, try to as used the metaphor here, I think fix the creaky house and
Mhm.
renovate it to weather the new storms that are certainly coming our way. I was quite proud with this sentence, actually. It makes quite a bit of sense. And it's quite, I think, elegant, but that's irrelevant as well. Yeah, I know it's not a great answer, but yeah, I think the point I was basically trying to make is, yeah, it's failing, but I think we do need to recognize the need for at least some kind of world order. And so if we recognize this, then um, we can, as we are propping the new world order up, we can also, make some improvements to the order, to make it
Mhm.
better.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know that in a TED talk you can't really say like the AI is gonna destroy the world or like the new world order will be anarchist or something like that. But since this is not a TED talk, I would say I think a more equitable world order or something like that is I would say kind of hard or somehow low-key impossible to achieve because I think you will also mention this in your like future, not in your future, in the remaining part of your TED talk, but the main point is that you need a like monopoly of power, or you need a sovereignty to achieve you want to achieve and uphold the world order. And that sovereignty will ultimately reside in one or or a block of or a few competing nations in the world. And I don't see how those nations would utilize their sovereignty and utilize their like monopoly of power in a vibrant way to the benefits of other people, or to the uh progress of humankind as a whole. So maybe I'm a pessimist here, but that is how I see the world order. Yes, maybe I would argue that the rules-based world order is failing, but maybe that is the best we can achieve, or something close to it.
Yeah, I think based on the literature that I have read and also my own personal reflections on this matter, I do believe, yeah, I think the easiest or the best way of achieving like an international order is for there to be a monopoly of power in probably ideally one country or one alliance. And that is because um, the rules-based order basically from a realist standpoint, what it does is it fills the anarchy that is inherent in the international system. And the only thing that can fill that um, inherent anarchy, can fill that the anarchic nature of the international order is a higher power. And that higher power, it has to be a strong country that has a monopoly over the world um, to enforce the rules and laws um, on the world. For example, like the police does in nations and communities, and also for it to work, that order or that country needs to be altruistic and use its power only in accordance with international law, which of course is um, very difficult for any country to do. For example, the unipolar moment was probably the closest humanity has ever been to that. But as you can see through, like for example, the Iraq War, and also perhaps to a lesser extent the bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO. Um, when you have that power, it's very difficult not to use it for your own advantage um, and personal gain. So yeah, I think it is probably true that it is very difficult for there to be an international order. Um, and because the best scenario, I think the best scenario is when there's a monopoly of power. I don't really recall. I remember like it doesn't come to mind exactly why uh two or more powers doesn't work because one would think that there's a there's a 牵制, which makes the order work. Um, but it doesn't come to mind exactly why it doesn't work this way. But I think, you know, if relying on a completely different theory, that of offensive realism by Professor Mershemeyer, it's that, two countries, two strong, great powers never can rise concurrently or rise peacefully because the stronger power or like the incumbent strong power will do everything they can to limit and minimize and impede the development of the, you know, rising power, and that will inevitably lead to conflict. So yeah, I think it is probably very difficult for there to be a rules-based order. I still do think that it like there can be, at least in theory, uh, and on paper, um, changes made to the current order that will make it slightly better. Um, but yeah, it probably won't function that well either. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Or maybe like we've talking about monopoly of power a lot. Yeah, but I think like monopoly of power and sovereignty, that stuff, I think that is ultimately like just one school of thought based on like Max Weber's
Yeah, yeah,
thought. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, what if like we view this whole thing maybe possibly in a Marxist way, like maybe like Marx would say, I don't know, there doesn't need to be a monopoly of power, but of course, I'm not a Marxist theorist, so I don't know about it much. But the thing I want to say is like maybe there could be some sort of a communal or sharing that of power or order that could exist if we are approaching the problem from a different lens.
Yeah, I think we should really do these podcasts during the day because, during the day I have much quicker thoughts and I have much clearer ideas. Right now, my mind isn't working that well. But I think, yeah, like if you were to see this world order, this whole concept, I think ideally, like theoretically, it shouldn't be that hard, right? There are
Mhm.
basic values that everyone agrees on, and you work from these basic values. And of course, there are going to be differences, but you agree to disagree, and you don't you don't disagree on the most important values, which I think again everyone agrees on, and from there, you work together, and you make the world a better place. But that just doesn't work, and I think one thing that I think that certainly has played a role in this is I think Western countries they do have a certain prejudice towards rising powers, especially I would say China, because you see from interviews from Western leaders, there is an entrenched idea that there is a China threat, and perhaps there is, I would say, but you know like at least one thing that, and I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes before, at least something that China doesn't do is China doesn't threaten to annex Canada and it doesn't threaten to annex Greenland.
Mhm.
But
True.
somehow in this context, Western countries still manage to frame China as a larger threat than other countries that have said this aloud. So yeah, I think for there to be greater cooperation, um, on basic values that everyone agrees upon and cooperation for the greater good, I think that, countries need to put aside their, prejudices or these conclusions that they have just decided to come to and really, you know, just you have to cooperate with people if you want there to be if you want there to be a world order, and you have to cooperate with them in a, nice way.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I want to kind of like build on the China threat you just mentioned. So I recently read a very interesting book called Why We Are Polarized. It's by Ezra Klein, which is the very famous American liberal political commentator. And I think he made a good point in the book that politics and politicians they kind of need an enemy. They need an enemy
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
to
Totally.
unite themselves and to keep their supporters like in terms of American domestic policies, that is, they need the enemy of another party, to help
Yeah,
their donation and their volunteer flowing. So that's why, like some of the candidates perform much better, in the general election because there is, the opponent from the opposing party as opposed to the primary elections, where you are basically competing with the people inside your party. So I think this is the same thing with China, that no matter which country, Western, American, European, or China, they all need a common enemy, not a common enemy. They need to portray an
yeah,
enemy
yeah,
that they
yeah,
could unite their populace with. So I think that
yeah.
is what it's doing, and of course that will create double standards and that will create hypocrisy, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that's also, for example, why immigration is such a issue, a polarizing issue in the world today, because governments are trying to uh frame immigrants as the enemy of the populace. And I mean, I think from the government's point of view, it's a good choice because immigrants they
Hmm.
are relatively weak in terms of political rights and stuff like that. Also, I think that's also what Viktor Orban, the method Viktor Orban used in his uh, five re-elections. I'm probably not that many. I think I'm getting him mixed with Lukashenko. But anyway, his many election victories. Basically, I think every election victory he had, he came up with a new enemy of the Hungarian people and united the populace behind that. Yeah, so I think that's a great point. And yeah, I think that yeah, I think for there to be cooperation, that needs to be changed. How to change that, I'm not really sure.
Well, as my client said, the need for enemy is rooted in our DNA, so he's
Yeah, yeah.
probably adopting quite a pessimistic view on that.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
mhm,
For example, I feel like the United Nations has been playing a diminishing role in the world today. I don't know if it's because I've grown up and become less naive, or if it's really happening. Also, I feel as if there hasn't been a work of international cooperation as grand as important as, and with the same level of fanfare as the Paris Accords, which was 10 years ago. The institutions and mechanism don't seem to be working, and what's more serious, neither does the spirit. The spirit doesn't seem to be there either. And I believe it's very important for us to do something about that, especially because in the world today, there are so many people warning or predicting that war is likely, war is inevitable. Leaders have mentioned it in speeches. There have been entire books written about it, and even a whole school of international relations predicts it. Offensive realism. Now, international theorists can be extraordinarily wrong, as some of my friends have reminded me over the past few days. But be that as it may, we still do have quite a great task ahead of us and quite a great burden in terms of the world order. It is up to us to renovate it so that it can restrain war, tackle pressing issues, and what always seems like an afterthought, address current inequities, along with
yeah. So, do you wanna kind of elaborate on the war part you said about like how like international relations theorists and like leaders are kind of like warning or predicting wars.
yeah, I'd first like to say that the sentence where I say that international theorists can be wrong, of course, very
Mm,
wrong, as some of my friends keep reminding me. That was a reference to you and your comments on Francis Fukuyama.
mhm.
Um, I think we can perhaps discuss his the end of history after both of us have read it.
Yeah,
Perhaps that
that'd
will
be a
be more
wise idea.
constructive than discussing it when neither of us have read it. But yeah, I think the inevitability of war that I mentioned in this speech is leaders. I think what's ironic is that out of the three claims I made, the first claim, leaders have mentioned it in the speeches, is the one that I have least evidence for. So no evidence comes to mind right now, even though I think it's something that leaders often say, but I don't have any
Maybe
examples of it
European
right
leaders
now.
say a lot. Maybe like
Okay.
Macron or Pol Poland, the
Oh
Poland
yeah,
one. I
yeah,
forgot
that
his
makes
name. Yeah,
sense. Anyway, like I've heard it, a lot, but I don't have
yeah.
any
I think I
examples that come
just
to mind.
yeah I just read. I think it was yesterday or today's. New York Times. The wrote something newspaper, and it said Macron was like warning a general European war, and yeah,
Okay.
kind of like
A,
mobilizing. It was also
a
kind of
very
a common enemy situation. So.
Yeah, a very avid reader of the New York Times you are. Yeah. Scholars have written whole books about it. It refers to the book on the Thucydides trap by a Harvard professor. I bel his name is Graham Allison. And it's called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides
Mhm.
Trap? I haven't read that book either. I want to read it, but I haven't read it yet either.
I've also
But
heard of it.
basically, yeah, the Thucydides trap is basically how the rising power will never allow the incumbent, leading power will never allow the rising power to rise or fail in the process. So there's, going to be conflict between the two. So that's the book that I was referencing. I think there are others, but that's the one that I know about. And the entire school of international relations that predicts it is offensive realism. Again, the school led by John J. Merschmeyer, who is a professor at the University of Chicago and the I would say the leading offensive realist in the world today. And I seem to be quoting him a lot in this speech because he's the only um, theorist whose books and ideas that I've actually read or listened to. So that's the only one that I can use rather confidently, and I think he makes quite a bit of sense. His book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, is basically on this, and he basically says that it's very kind of similar to this Thucydides trap. So basically, a very quick recap of John J. Merschmeyer and offensive realism. His idea is basically that all countries, what they want to achieve is regional hegemony. What this means is, in their hemisphere, in their region, they are the only power uh,
Mhm.
with that ability. And, in the world today, there is only one regional hegemon, and that would be the United States, right? There is no power in the Western Hemisphere that can threaten them, and they have two vast oceans, really. Um, they have two vast oceans separating them from everyone else. And they will do everything they can to ensure that other countries don't do regional hegemon to become a regional hegemon, because in that scenario, that other country would be able to threaten their preeminence as the world's leading power. And this isn't they're like the morals involved in this don't really matter. Whether the other actor is a benevolent actor or not doesn't matter from a rational standpoint. To minimize the risk of you being supplanted as the leading power, you need to make sure that there's no other power that even has the ability to do that. So leading powers will always do their best to impede the development of the rising power. And it is such an existential threat that they need to take action, sometimes even armed
Mhm.
action, to ensure that doesn't happen. So it also does, to an extent, predict that there will be armed conflict and such competition and perhaps war between countries. So that's what I was referencing here. Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah, so I'm glad to say that all of these, claims that I made have, have evidence to back them. So I wasn't, making claims that were unfounded.
Mhm. Yes, I was just a bit curious about the Mercerheimer thing you mentioned. Yeah, yeah. Did
Mm.
he like explicitly said there will be a war, or like do you think like in like contemporary terms, the war could mean like not the type of like World War I or World War II, like those hot wars you'd be seeing could be like a cultural war, or perhaps be it economic or technological war. I think those prospects are indeed uh becoming more and more realistic as American certainly has increasing its influence throughout the world, whether it's through English or scholarship program or whatsoever, or like museums or whatsoever it is, or movies. Yeah, I think movies is perhaps a really apt item of American soft power, or the cultural influence of America around the world. So will that be necessarily be a hot war?
Yeah, I think in offensive realism, I think Rushmeyer's main point around is around security comparison and security competition in military and hot war. I don't think he mentions like other things that much. His main point is around survival and great power competition and armed conflict.
Because like I think United States certainly did not destroy Soviet Union directly through a hot war. It was
Mm.
through a mix of cultural, ideological, and perhaps most importantly, economic competition that collapsed
Yeah.
Soviet Union. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the examples he cites of previous possible hegemons in the world throughout history were like the Soviet Union, Japan, Imperial Germany, and stuff like that. Um, that had the potential in their heyday to become a regional hegemon over their region. But yeah, I think that's a very good point that the Soviet Union was not destroyed in a hot war, but rather other forms of competition. So yeah, I think, perhaps other forms of competition also are important, but I think perhaps it culminates in armed conflict.
Yeah, certainly there is a prospect of armed conflict, but I also think there's one kind of like interesting like observations. So like you mentioned the rise of hegemon, and I'm not like particular familiar with the theory, I will say, but like I
Mm.
think the rise of like the United States, it was comparatively rather peaceful, or like it did not like directly at least involved in many hot wars because the American is creating like what you say a regional power if I'm like interpreting the theory correct in the Americas and I think like in terms of like the United States attempt to like capture or influence America like through the Monroe Doctrine and all those sort of stuff um it did perhaps receive some of like British or French counter influence in the 19th and perhaps the early 20th century, but I did not see it being that impeded by the British or other stuff.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And it reminds me that I have to read the book again before I, have college interviews on political theory. No, I think I would say that the United States really didn't rise that peacefully out of power. It was quite expansionist in its beginning, and I think throughout history. I mean, it started as 13 colonies on the Atlantic, bordering the Atlantic, and it ended up it ended up scaling the entire American continent, and that's because it through armed conflict it expanded westward. It had wars with Native Americans, Native American nations, with Mexico, with the Spanish and the Spanish American War. So I don't think their rise was that peaceful. In terms of why the UK didn't impede their growth, I think that's a good question. I think um, yeah, there probably wasn't a great war between the UK and the US. There wasn't. Like for example, in the early 20th century when the US was rising. I think one thing that Mershenmeyer does say is very important is oceans because oceans are very difficult to cross. And I
Hmm.
think the UK being on the other side of the Atlantic, they probably found it rather difficult and rather costly to control the United States. And perhaps they weighed it and they thought it was in their best interest not to because I don't think they saw that. I don't think they thought the United States would rise to be a adversarial power to them.
Yeah, I agree.
Because they are basically of the same culture. They came from, after all, British and European immigrants, and also I think they were just really unable to do that because I think geographically, if you look at the two countries, they're so far away, and the geographical blessing that the United States has is really unrivaled by
Well,
basically any country
technically,
in the world.
Canada is like still part of the United Kingdom or like the British Dominion back then, so maybe that wasn't
Oh,
such a big of problem. But
oh
I
yeah.
believe it will still be a logistical problem and probably like getting the consent of the people in Canada. But yeah, technically,
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
it wasn't that far away still.
that's a good
But
point that I also missed.
I certainly agree with your like argument about the culture, about how they are both like English and kind of like Anglo-Saxon countries, and perhaps it is also because they have a larger common enemy, which is Germany, as it turned out in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah, that's later on in the 20th century, and yeah, I also think that they probably weighed it and they thought that they probably couldn't really restrain the growth of the United States because
Mhm.
again, I think taking a very deterministic view of geography, which is mentioned in Prisoners of Geography, which is also a decent book by Tim Marshall. Um,
Which is
you
one
know,
book that I was reading right now.
well, yeah, yeah, it's a book on the Oxford Geography book list. So I
Mhm.
finished it, I think, last semester. But anyway, I think after reading the book, one thing that I think a takeaway that I had is, geography is very important, and the blessing in terms of geography of the United States is rivaled perhaps only to an extent by China. No other country in the world can say that um, they have the geography and therefore the potential that the United States has in terms of land resources, the two seas that really stave off any serious foreign invasion. I think the UK probably looked at that and thought, it was really not going to be able to restrain the growth of the United States, even if they wanted to. So, perhaps it'd be a better idea to have good relations with them and allow them to grow.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, so that was the first part of my speech, basically. It was the theory part.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, the second part of my speech we'll talk about next episode. It's about, what we can do to help and perhaps address the certain issues that our world order is facing, and how we can make the world a better place in the future, which is, I think, which is why there is any relevance between my talk and the theme, which is, I guess, see what we want to leave behind. Basically, my point
Mhm.
was, we want to leave a better world order behind. How will we do that? Well, I guess we'll talk about that next episode.
Okay. See you next episode then.
Yes, thank you for watching.